My talk today will be about three projects, one in Shanghai, two in New York, but comparing the way in which projects are conceived and asking the question about how we learn in practicing from one context to ply our trade in another. So let's see. I'll begin because I think I saw George Binder in the back of the room with an image from a Belgian artist, James Ensor. The subject I want to get into in comparing these two places of practice is density and porosity, or mass and public space, as manifested in the ground plane in particular. And so this etching is very apropos because we see sort of mass in a building, masses of people on the ground, and the question is raised, what is the relationship between? In the Harvey Wiley Corbett very imaginary view of the city of the future, of course, he then went on to influence Rockefeller Center, so he was a practitioner as well. But there is an image and a vision of a multiplication of the ground plane. What happens when density is so great that we need to create more space for people at the ground? But at the same time, there's something pathological about this drawing. There is no ground plane. It's kind of a nightmare rather than a dream, although it's fascinating. So it asks the question, how can so much interest be brought into a very limited band of ground, one level below grade, and perhaps one above? So if we think of the high-rise rather than an object that's planted on the ground, which is how I think we can see many great high-rises, Empire State Building and Chrysler Building, a number of buildings in Pudong included, we can also see the high-rise as a building which grows from the strands of the fabric that makes the city, rather than as something independent. So if we think about the grain of the city as the progenitor of the buildings, the source of building design, and we look at four examples. The first one is Rockefeller Center. Obviously, that's not a KPF design, but we have done three buildings in Rockefeller Center since its early stage of completion. And also ask, what is it in that fabric zone from which a high-rise comes that makes a place special? What's the spirit of the place, the genius loci, marked in a red dot? So let's follow these four projects. First of all, just to talk, not in the abstract, but in a lateral way, about grain. The grain of a city is something in an illustration here, which we can see in one part or another, but if we start to focus, whether it's material, or here in the left bank of Paris, the pattern of streets, or if we look at Seoul as an illustration of a series of generations, decade by decade, displaying themselves on different hillsides and focusing in on one to see how the 1950s or 60s carpeted part of the north part of the river. Or if we come to New York and see different neighborhoods, different cities, in fact, of Brooklyn and New York as they were separated for a long time. One of the sort of urbane office district and the other of warehouses and a more earthy kind of texture. So the grain of the city is something we can read as architects. It's as important to think about at the beginning of a project as structure or elevatoring system, budget, or program. So in Rockefeller Center, these dreamers and these collaborative architects of Raymond Hood et al. Made an architecture which was very much of an intrusion or disruption of what was there before, but it came out of a kind of reification of rectangular form, of carving away and making something of a collective series of buildings out of the model. But that works its way also into the fabric of the buildings. So Hugh Ferris made a kind of abstraction and at the same time a very concrete set of illustrations out of what can be seen as the plan of the city extruded, but also the zoning kind of formulae that then were instilled into the books of law in New York. And he, in fact, was a friend and collaborator of Corbett. And so here we could see this plan, a very simple block plan. It really is only three full blocks that give us the core, the kernel of Rockefeller Center. But the way that the public space is made and the special space, the skating rink, Prometheus, the terracing, very careful modulation of section that makes the heart of what we think of as Midtown, is also anchored by a subgrade network. The grain also runs underground. It's one of probably New York's best piece of subgrade placemaking, throughput of people, and a kind of engineering of a complex, as the whole of Rockefeller Center is unified by one basement of one set of mechanical services and logic. But up on the ground, this spirit of the place, which Paul Manship gave to actually rather clumsy sculptures, but they become old friends by now, have given us a kind of local mythology of art and sculpture and Christmas trees and Anish Kapoors and whatnot that give a place to this grain made vertical. And here you see in red a few projects which KPF has done over the years. So along with others, there's this kind of accretive quality to a series of buildings which makes a cluster, because the cluster can grow, the grain can proliferate itself. So in Shanghai, just near the Jing'an Temple site and near the Portman Hotel, is a site developed by Carey Properties in the Jing'an district. It is, in a way, an inheritor of Rockefeller Center as we conceived it. It was finished about a year ago. And the building, it's really a series of buildings cluster around a public space. But the grain of the city here is, rather than, as we all know, a rational set of gridded avenues and streets, it is a patchwork, at least in concept. Surrounding the site might be something quite different, because there have been interruptions of the Chinese exhibition center given by the Russians at some point, by the Portman Hotel, by the flyover. But the block structure of concession-era Shanghai as we know it is this kind of displacement of rectangular elements or more irregular ones to make occasional spaces that are discovered in a kind of meandering maze-like way. And so this has become the kind of the underlying pattern, if you will, the guiding principle of this project. And you see here a plan of it of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 buildings, depending on how they're defined, but 2 major tall buildings of mixed use, of office, hotel, retail, public transport, entertainment, and so on. But the public spaces in between then come together in a kind of somewhat chaotic, deliberately chaotic way. In the middle, you'll see a small red cube, which is the house of Mao Zedong. At least he lived there for some 8 months in his youth, in the early 20s. And you can see it on the right-hand side here, and this kind of piazza that results from this jostling of rectangular elements with a hotel and its restaurant to the right, left, and office building to the right. And there is a kind of collage of rectangular proportions, of curtain wall elements, of multiplication of different proportions nested together to make a whole fabric. And here you see the figure ground of the ground plane with Mao's house in the middle. So rather than John D. Rockefeller skating rink, we have the house of the leader of modern China, the founding of modern China. And that sort of collage of curtain wall types and of geometries, proportions brought into the tower. And each module corresponds somewhat to a specific program, to the base system of office or to the module of the hotel. I'm trying to move us ahead, which you can see here in perspective, along with a varying depth of wall expressions, some exoskeletal, some embedded in the plane of the wall, some recessed. And then at the base, there is this jostling of boxes, almost like a series of presents at the base of a Christmas tree, which are mounding up to ascend to the larger scale, which can be seen coming together in very surprising ways, which I think are pleasing to the eye, but most of all, they give a sense of urban vitality, even if they're seen devoid of people in the abstract here. And ultimately, there is some relationship between the Mao's house and the towers In fact, the Mao's house has its own bit of exoskeletal balcony and its fringe work, which is then reiterated in the tower. And this is all sort of made by, in a way, it's a great capitalist of modern Hong Kong, Robert Kwok. At the base of the building is one store, which KPF designed separately from the rest, a separate commission, but it's its own kind of temple, Michael Kors' flagship store. And in the grain of that facade is a series of highly reflective metals, is a kind of dancing around of different aspects of a grid made random through a kind of scripting of backs and forths, as you can see here. So this is built in one corner of this complex, coming down to the micro scale. So Hudson Yards, to come now to New York, this is in a way quite atypical of New York projects because it's not one block, it's not within a block, it's rather a set of buildings built outside the grain of the city or of Manhattan, because it's a decking over of vast rail yards of Penn Central that have been a kind of scar in the city and an unoccupied zone for the last 100 years or so. So this project, while I'm waiting for the button, has been undertaken by a private developer, by Related, Steve Ross, working with my partners at KPF, Bill Pedersen, Paul Katz, Marianne Kwok, among others, and a series of other architects. It's a collaborative sort of venture of 5, 6, eventually 7, 8, 9 architects, much as Rockefeller Center was a cast of many. In the middle, then, is Hudson Yards' own piece of spirit of place, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the project starts with a sort of impacted zone of the 2 tall office towers very close to the regular grain of the grid of the city. And as we move out towards the Hudson, we find the master plan, which is obviously not fully rendered here. You'll see in a minute in the plan. It becomes more diffuse. The building and the platform, the whole amalgam stretches visually and in orientation back towards Penn Station. So it links the center of Manhattan towards the edge. Hopefully when most of you come to New York, you'll be able to tour the site because some of these buildings are well underway. So tremendous challenge of over $1 billion of decking over a void. And this brings also a challenge of planning, of how does one make an artificial ground plane multi-building complex in a city that's not used to this. And so the master plan here, showing 2 towers in blue with a kind of an orange retail zone, and then moving out along a central open space axis, gradually becoming less and less solid, more and more void, less organized and more playful, but still bringing through very key elements of the Manhattan plan, and those which many of you know about or experience, the High Line, which starts all the way down in Tribeca, coming through and swerving around. It's kind of a link, a thread, a tie, and then tracks underneath, north-south axes continued along 11th, binding at 10th, and then new axes of parkways in the city plan which stretch north. So it's very much a linked project, even though it's a new platform. The platform is suggested in a way, or there is a precursor here in the High Line itself, because it's 1 or 2 levels above grade, it's artificial, and so in a way is the ground plane of Hudson Yards. But it's really impossible to say what's artificial and what's a natural grade at this point, because over tracks and over infrastructure, everything has to be redefined. So when we come to the building, we can see that it pulls itself out in a kind of a stilt structural form so as to allow this thread of the High Line, which, though small in dimension, has tremendous impact in the life of Manhattan. And the building also mediates between the lower grade entry, which you see a sliver of here, on 11th Avenue, with several internal spaces that bring you up to the new ground on the other side. And here you can see this sort of artificiality of a deck over rail in the part of the site that allows more structure to come through here versus the broader track splay towards the Hudson. What binds the two towers together is a mass of 7 or 8 stories of retail whose vertical stretch and section is something we're just not used to in New York. This is more of an idea and a set of skills in planning and manipulation that comes from the Chinese, Hong Kong, and other Asian retail building solutions. It's quite daring in New York terms, where we stick to the ground, or we have a department store, or Time Warner AOL, we might have 3 or 4 stories. In the distance, you see the diagonal culture shed. So that is, in a minute, I'll show you a bit of it, the sort of the center of meaning in the project. But as we look up the tower, it's actually a number of buildings placed on top of each other. At the very top is a cantilever about 50 feet. So a bit of structural daring, a constructional challenge, budget challenge that probably wouldn't fit into the repertoire of Manhattan buildings of the 1980s and 90s. So again, there's an influence of the spirit of the practice that has come from a set of global practitioners and thinkers, which I think Steve Ross, in a way, has in mind, along with our designers, in which can be held a number of kinds of program uses. So back to the ground plane, this, if there is a genius loci of this project, it's the culture shed. And it's something which I actually can't talk about, and I don't know that much about it. My colleagues will be able to, I hope, within a year or so. But it's a piece of art which is unprecedented as a piece of public art in scale, budget, impact. Suffice to say, it will have more sort of draw and awe associated with it than even the Rockefeller Center skating rink. And the culture shed itself, which is Diller Scofidio Renfro's amazing building, which rolls itself out as a kind of a movable building on a kind of a railroad track wheel system. And then beyond that, on the ground plane, as we see from the Heinlein point of view, this open space in which will come something which perhaps by next year's conference one can show, because it really fits this subject matter very, very well. So to finish, I want to show you a project which has just been made publicly, it's been discussed in public because it was under wraps for a while. It's a tower, planned for a tower, which is not fully approved, but it's making its way quite close to approval, next to Grand Central Terminal. So it's a sort of a counterpoint to Hudson Yards, in that it's not a multiple building project, it's not a cluster, it's one individual tower. But it fits itself into a transit hub district, roughly the terminal city, once envisioned a long time ago, and now somewhat completed by taller buildings. You see this tower from the point of view of Bryant Park. So there is public space already embodied in the plan of the city. But what's important in this building is that at the base of the building, and again, this most dense of building types, because it's an FAR 30 building, which is quite a heavy lift for New York zoning and legal discussion, but only made possible by its relationship with the terminal and its way of giving back space from the needs and the opportunities of the train concourse, the great public space with the information booth in the middle, to allow this building to serve that space and benefit from it. So I want to show you how that happens. At the base of the building, our attempt is to slice it off in a way on a diagonal, to offer views, to offer uses, to offer a kind of terracing of visibly accessible and physically accessible public realm at the base, thank you, and to gesture towards what is these days New York's most hallowed landmark, because it's just celebrated its 100th anniversary, and many remember the day when Jackie Onassis came to stop the demolition of this building after Penn Station had been demolished. And so along with the openings and the visual accessibility of this building, this tower, comes the demapping or remapping of a street, which is kind of useless anyway, Vanderbilt Avenue, into a piazza So there is already a kind of stretching out of the influence zone of the building towards the terminal. And then underground, because this is where many of these large cluster urban engine projects really test their mettle, is the connection to public transit, not only Grand Central Terminal, but a new system of east side access which will double the peak ridership of train passengers coming in from Long Island. So it's a tremendous challenge for the old building, and only as we see it through and within the property line of the new building is that pressure relieved. So by public benefit of this connection and the city and the MTA getting that, deriving that benefit, the private developer is allowed to build another 10, roughly, FAR. So you can imagine the hundreds of millions of dollars which come with that, and then the public benefit that comes back through allowing these people to come through, not only underground, but at grade. Then there is a public hall, which is embedded inside the building. So who's the landlord, and who's the operator, and who's the builder, and who finances it is all obviously carefully worked out, but it's also quite tricky and a little ambiguous, at least to us. Here you see a view into the train hall, whether that's art, whether it's a vegetal wall or whatever. The idea is that this space becomes a kind of adjunct to the public park outside. And then the public zone, or the feeling of being able to enjoy benefit from this building, even if you don't rent space in it, and it's an office building, forgot to say, is not only down at the base, it's as intended now at the top of the building as well, where a quite extensive series of terraces of occupied space will give the sort of crown of the city as a permeable, transparent, crystalline object, the kind of zenith and the crescendo for the project. So to finish up, but we move from one to the other, maybe we'll all participate in the kind of debate that will come up in a year of how we learn in moving from one context to another. I think we all recognize two cities at very different stages of their respective development. You know, each one is older and newer than the other, depending how we define those terms. But the legal constraints, the construction methods, the market needs in each are a bit different from each other. At the same time, the two cities are very much twins. They're market centers, they're international cities. New York is not Washington, Shanghai is not Beijing. And ultimately, I think we feel in our work, whether we're engineers, architects, planners, or developers, that there is a kind of acceleration of learning that happens with a dialectic. You don't learn anything speaking with somebody who knows what you know and does what you do. You learn from the person who's seeing things from a different angle. And I think part of the point of showing the pleasure that we've taken in working on these projects here and there and here is the kind of stepping stone advantage that one can take in this cross-fertilization between cities, between continents, between markets and places and times.